This is a regular meeting of the Urbana Community Development Commission, and this meeting will now come to order. And next on our agenda is roll call. Oh,
Do it for, okay, George Francis. Janice Bankston.
Here.
Ann Hines Silvis. Fred Cobb.
here?
Chris Diana. Jerry Moreland.
Here.
Elizabeth Searing.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. Next is approval of the minutes, and we have minutes from our last meeting, March 25th, 2014, so we'll take a minute to review those. Okay, I think most of us have reviewed those minutes. I'll entertain a motion for approval or corrections. Okay, we have a motion to approve the minutes as written. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to approve the minutes as written. Any comments or corrections, modifications? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, no. Ayes have it, and the minutes stand approved as written. Okay, next on our agenda is petitions and communications. However, we have no one in the audience, so we'll move on to staff report.
Okay. Basically, the only thing we received from HUD was our official notice letter regarding grant allocations, and I made a copy of our updated budget to show you the amounts that we received from HUD for CDBG in our home. And then you can see the rest of the activities that staff have done and the meetings that we have attended. So that's the staff report.
Okay. Are there any questions or comments from commissioners? Okay, with that, we'll move on. Next is old business. We have nothing scheduled or indicated under old business. Would anyone like to bring up any old business at this time? Okay, staff, anything pertaining to old business?
No, no
Okay.
old business.
Okay, any new business? We have nothing under new business.
No business, new business. What we're having is the study session,
Yeah.
basically giving information about Fair Housing Month, and I will let Jen talk about that. And
So each year, HUD, along with communities such as ours, we recognize Fair Housing Month. We do various activities. This year we decided to show a video that HUD had put together, which I thought was pretty good, actually. I think it's about 20 minutes long, and it's addressing some of the more current fair housing issues that are going on in our country today. They look specifically at some of the, all the case studies that they look at are actually happening in New York, but there's no reason to say that those sorts of occurrences aren't taking place in our community. So I think we'll start just by watching the video, and then afterwards I wanted to kind of highlight some of the additional classes that are protected in Urbana that actually I was unaware of before looking into this. So I found it to be rather interesting, and I have my own little story to go along with it. So I will let Kelly go ahead and start the video. Go ahead and get comfortable. And we'll, yeah, sorry, no popcorn. And we'll go from there. And hopefully it'll start.
You mean chicken wings, don't you?
I think is there a mic?
I was shown a nice apartment up on the top floor by the super of the building. We were looking around, you poking around as you do look in the closets and this, and oh, this looks nice. Yeah, okay, I gotta get my wife to come and see this. And we went over and looked out the window a little bit, and he looked around and he said, listen, I've been doing this for 30 years in this building, and I've never let one black person live here yet.
Housing discrimination is very prevalent in American life, and one of the ways we know that is through studies that are conducted by private fair housing groups, that there really is pervasive discrimination in terms of rental housing, in terms of people who are trying to buy homes. They may do it in a very friendly way. They may direct you to a different kind of housing opportunity. They may say, oh, I suddenly have nothing available.
Looking for an apartment in New York City is like Navy SEAL training. I mean, it's pretty intense. You're gonna go through a lot of apartments, looking for apartments on Craigslist, looking through brokers. It can be quite challenging.
Constantly running around to all different corners of the city, and then also presenting your credentials. Our financial situation was good, that our credit was good, we both had good jobs, we both have good backgrounds. There was nothing that we could think of that would disqualify us from getting the best apartment that we could afford. We both had really sort of clear criteria as far as what we wanted in terms of apartments. I wanted something that was spacious and sunny and lots of light and whatever. We wanted enough room for ourselves to be comfortable, nice neighborhood, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, we found this one in Park Slope, and it seemed ideal. From the description, from the pictures. There was a big snowstorm in progress. It was just beginning on Saturday. And there were not a lot of people who called Andrea, who lived there, to make appointments to see the apartment. So we got there first. We were the first ones who saw it. Apparently, we were the only ones who saw it because the other couple that was scheduled to come by never did make it because of the storm. It was beautiful. When we saw it, it was exactly what we were looking for. It was spacious and sunny, and the apartment itself was in good condition. The building was in good condition. The neighborhood was great. It was ideal.
Immediately, Steve phoned the real estate broker to rent the apartment.
We had a pretty good exchange. She gave me a list of items that I would need to bring in order to begin the application process. She faxed over the material. She goes, it sounds like you guys are good and qualified candidates. I told her our credit score was excellent. She was excited on the phone. I told her that the next morning I'd be there bright and early. She said, okay, great, we'll see you tomorrow morning. Wednesday, I go to the realty office, and I asked the receptionist, is Roseanne available? Roseanne heard me. She stood up and said, hello, can I help you? And I began the process of giving her all of my paperwork. As I'm giving her my IDs to make a copy for my wife and I, the receptionist turns and says, the copier's broken. At the time, Roseanne had a peculiar look on her face, as though that's news to her.
Steve went to a nearby shop to get the copies himself.
I come back, I give her a photocopy of our IDs, and I start to pull out money in order to pay for the application fee. And she's told me that I'm not gonna take your money. And I was like, why not? And she said that there are other applications ahead of yours, so if we get to yours, we'll contact you. And I was just shocked and stunned. I was of the impression that I was a very different circumstance.
This is this common phrase that people talk about in fair housing, that real estate brokers or landlords, they discriminate with a handshake and a smile. It's actually done often in a sort of congenial way, as if what we should expect is that you want to live over there with other minorities and not in this neighborhood. We have nothing for you here.
It just seemed incredible to us that in this day and age in New York City, that someone would decide that we weren't qualified to live there because of our race.
Prior to 1968, landlords, real estate agents, they could just post a sign or tell you to your face, we're not going to rent to people like you.
With the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, the federal government made such practices illegal. But only after years of implementing policies that had enforced discrimination and segregation in housing.
In the 1930s, the federal government started getting involved in the housing market in a big way for the first time because of the Great Depression.
Most people couldn't afford to buy their homes because you had to put down 50 to 80% down payment in order to purchase a home, which of course would put that out of the reach of many Americans. And the federal government decided it wanted to really build the middle class. And the way that it would do that would be to start insuring home loans.
Homeownership is the basis of a happy, contented family life. And now, through the use of a National Housing Act insured mortgage, is brought within the reach of all citizens. For instance, a 20% down payment and $40 a month will buy an attractive bungalow like this.
But the government wasn't willing to treat Americans equally when it insured these home loans. It began to create maps that it could determine which areas were most insurable and which areas were less insurable.
They were pretty strict about not insuring mortgages and housing that was being built in what you might consider racially changing or racially integrated neighborhoods. Refusing to insure mortgages was creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. What would happen is if there were a few blacks on the block, the federal government says, we're not going to insure mortgages here because property values might decline. Now, people can't get a mortgage to buy properties on the block, so property values do decline.
About 98% of the home loans given to Americans under these programs went to white Americans, and they began to flee the cities as black neighborhoods began to get more concentrated and more poor. By the 1960s, half of all black Americans were now living outside of the South, and they were living in largely industrial cities in the North and the Midwest, cities like Chicago, New York, Newark, Milwaukee. And they were living in pretty tightly constrained areas that were very dense, very poor, and pretty dilapidated.
Low quality or substandard housing was perhaps the major problem. In other words, people lived in slums, buildings that didn't have adequate ventilation, or sometimes they didn't have indoor plumbing.
The federal government began to give a lot of money to cities to kind of clean these neighborhoods up. They started then to bulldoze entire black communities, and what they built in their place to kind of house these people were these large housing projects.
So the federal government, when they started providing funding for public housing, they were required to leave it to the local jurisdiction to decide where it was going to be built. Typically, they did that by segregating the housing, building public housing for whites in white neighborhoods and building public housing for blacks in black neighborhoods.
And so suddenly you had thousands of almost entirely poor African Americans cut off from any type of opportunity, cut off from shopping centers, cut off from white communities, often by highway systems or by rivers or by train tracks. And so these communities became very, very isolated.
In the wake of the civil rights movement in the South, during the 1960s, these northern urban communities experienced increasing unrest.
The ghettos that had been created by federal policy began to combust. From 1965 until 1968, more than 100 northern cities burst into flames.
No society can tolerate massive violence any more than a body can tolerate massive disease. We need to know the answer, I think, to three basic questions about these riots. What happened? Why did it happen? What can be done to prevent it from happening again and again?
President Lyndon B. Johnson appointed the Kerner Commission to study the causes of urban unrest. In March 1968, The commission report found America's white majority and the federal government complicit in creating the conditions underlying the riots. The commission stated that America was becoming two separate and unequal nations, one black and one white.
Then Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is shot on the balcony of a Memphis hotel, and cities across the nation burst out in rioting as distraught African Americans and ghetto communities take to the streets. Tanks are rolling across American cities. Army combat troops are in the Capitol, and Congress is being guarded by the National Guard for fear that some of the rioters in ghetto neighborhoods just feet from the Capitol will come there. It is in that atmosphere that this nation was finally able to pass the Fair Housing Act.
The Fair Housing Act did two very important things. And the one that everybody focused on at the time was that it outlawed discrimination on the basis of race in housing transactions. There was another provision that mandated that all federal departments and agencies administer their housing and community development programs in a manner that affirmatively furthers fair housing. That second directive really speaks to and acknowledges the role that the federal government had heretofore played in creating and perpetuating and supporting and exacerbating not just a dual housing market, but a dual society.
In the area of housing, the Fair Housing Act now protects people based on race, color, national origin, sex, family status, religion, and disability. Many states and local communities have passed fair housing laws that offer additional protections based on age, marital status, source of income, sexual orientation, and other characteristics. Many of the cases brought on behalf of victims of discrimination are pursued with the assistance of nonprofit fair housing organizations across the country. These cases take many forms. In 2006, 43-year-old William moved to New York City.
I was looking for apartments, and I found one in the Bronx. A one-bedroom apartment. It was nice, small, and I was happy, you know, wanted to fix it up and have everything in its place and all that.
His new home felt comfortable until the day one of his neighbors came to his door.
She said she wanted to talk to me, and I said, sure. What's up? She told me that the super told her that there was a fag living next door and for her to watch her husband because I was gonna rape him. I don't let everybody know that I'm gay, but practically everybody knows.
Later, the super began to harass William directly.
And about 2007, that's when the name calling started. He was calling me a fag, you know, calling me a whore, you know, names like that, and I felt uncomfortable. We usually get our rents. They give it to the super puts it under the door to each tenant. So I went to my house, and when I opened my door, my rent bill was already under the door. When I opened it, I was kind of shocked. My rent bill, he put fag on it.
William repeatedly found his door and mailbox defaced with anti-gay slurs, and he was verbally harassed when he left his apartment.
I don't know if he has something against gay people, I don't know. But he hasn't harassing everybody in the building but me.
The other tenants joined William in signing complaints to building managers, asking them to remove the super.
I'm asking him, what's gonna happen? This is going too far now. I don't want to stay there and wait until it gets violent. And he said, no, we're working on it. We thought we were going to fire him, but we have to go through all the paperwork. If it does happen, you'll be the first one to know. He never called. I never got a response or anything.
For the management company or the landlord of a building where they've received a complaint about harassment, often turning the other way and not doing anything appears to them in the short run to be the best response, because for them, maybe the tenant will move out, they'll just rent to somebody else.
I was saying, why should I leave if I'm paying my rent? I'm supposed to be safe in my own apartment. Why they don't get rid of him?
In the situation where a tenant is being harassed, if they've complained to the landlord about the harassment and the landlord hasn't taken steps to stop it, what are their options?
Eventually, William found help at the Fair Housing Justice Center, which investigated his complaint and connected him to attorneys. After hearing testimony about the numerous incidents of continued harassment by the building superintendent and the inaction of building management, a jury ruled in favor of William and awarded damages.
You don't know when it's safe to be at home, and maybe it is never safe to be at home. And that kind of harassment, which is very common, whether it's racial harassment or harassment because of sexual orientation, leaves people very frightened, fearful. It might happen again to them in the next place that they live. And what can they do to help prevent the harassment in the future? What's challenging is that that harassment is not something that they've caused.
I never swore at him or got loud with him, talked to him nasty. I went with him with respect from day one all the way to now. But they disrespected me. So at least I got my justice though, and I'm glad.
It can never be said enough that when individuals step forward and exercise their rights, file a lawsuit, and are successful in doing that, there are just tremendous outcomes, not only for them, but for the community.
Fighting private market discrimination and harassment is only one part of the task in opening up housing markets in America. Institutional challenges remain.
The decisions that are made by the federal government, by state and local actors, as to whether to encourage more building in low-poverty neighborhoods have a tremendous effect on residential segregation.
The low-income housing tax credit grew out of the Tax Reform Act of 1986 that took place when Ronald Reagan was president. It was a way to encourage developers to develop affordable housing.
Some believed that privately developed dwellings using these tax credits would create mostly mixed-income developments, making for more racially mixed housing. But it turned out that the credits were more profitable for developers who built all affordable units.
The low-income housing tax credit also has some tendency to concentrate the development within relatively poor neighborhoods. In some ways, that's actually an inherent design of the program. Developers actually get a bigger credit if they develop in a high-poverty neighborhood.
Housing is a matter of place. The whole notion of geography of opportunity, if you will, is really the key, and the geography of opportunity is driven by where you live.
Housing segregation impacts every other opportunity that people have access to. It affects what type of schools you'll get to go to, what type of grocery stores you're going to have in your neighborhood, whether you live near places with lots of toxins or not, whether you have lots of parks in your neighborhood. These are real effects on real people, and the reason that real estate agents say location, location, location is they're not selling you a house, they're selling you a community.
While concentrations of affordable housing in poor and minority neighborhoods tend to cut people off from opportunity, a federal housing voucher program offers low-income recipients the freedom to choose housing in other areas.
It's a program that the federal government runs with states and localities that provides people a rental subsidy that allows them to access housing in the private markets.
Housing choice subsidies can reduce concentrations of poverty. They offer recipients the opportunity to find housing in any area as long as the subsidy covers the rent. But exercising that choice is often extremely difficult.
Source of income discrimination is quite prevalent in the housing industry. It is discrimination based on an individual and family's source of income, like their family might receive a voucher. In the last few years, in the last decade, we've really seen an increase in states and localities beginning to have laws that say you cannot discriminate based on the source of income.
Even though New York City prohibits discrimination against people using housing subsidies, many housing providers still do so.
I have AIDS, so when I don't have housing. It makes it so difficult for me to take my medication on time.
Housing is key for anyone living with HIV and AIDS because where they live needs to be clean and safe because that home is their lifeline to healthy living.
HASA is a part of HRA, the Human Resources Administration. It stands for HIV/AIDS Service Administration, and it helps us find housing if we're homeless. It helps us with Medicaid and medical assistance.
In New York City, a great number of people living with HIV and AIDS are dependent on a housing subsidy to help pay for rent. And when they go out into the rental market with that housing subsidy and are discriminated against, they're told very specifically that they are not going to be shown apartments that everyone else is shown.
I thought that because I was able to afford up to $1,180 in an apartment, that finding an apartment wouldn't be that difficult, because since HASA subsidized the rent, it was going to be a definite rent payment to the landlord. So, I mean, who doesn't want guaranteed rent money? I would try to get out of the realtors first that they had a one-bedroom apartment available. And once they told me, oh yeah, sure, we have a one-bedroom apartment available. And then when I say, okay, well, I have a HASA subsidy, suddenly there are no more one-bedroom apartments available. They even said to me, well, some of our apartments are for regular people and some are for program people.
The apartments that people here in New York living with HIV and AIDS are given an opportunity to rent are the apartments that no one else wants to rent. And that means that they're often moving into apartments that are not healthy places for them to be living.
None of the apartments I've seen were finished apartments. They were always apartments in the state of repair.
What they're being shown is often very substandard housing. It may not have even operating water or heat. It may not be in good physical condition.
It seemed that it was all that was available for me to move into. You know, when somebody shows you crap, you try to take the best of the crap.
Keith finally settled for a one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, but when he went back with the keys to move in, he couldn't believe what he saw.
There was roaches in the kitchen and roaches on the floor, as if an exterminator came in and a lot of the roaches died. There was somebody's clothes in the apartment. The stove was not connected to the wall. Actual outlet sockets was melded onto the floor. The place was in no condition to be inhabited. So I spoke with the closer and told the closer about the condition of the apartment, and she minimized it and said, well, all you have to do, Mr. Short, is sweep the roaches up. It affected my self-esteem in a big way because I thought that, well, maybe I am a piece of crap. Maybe this is what I deserve.
People respond very differently to discrimination. Some people respond by internalizing it, concerns that they did something to cause it, that there might be something they could do differently the next time to prevent it.
I thought that it was just a way of doing business. I thought that was the norm, and actually it was the norm, but the norm was illegal, and you couldn't do that. And I did not know that until I went to the Fair Housing Justice Center. They sent testers out to real estate agencies to see how they dealt with people who were on programs as opposed to how they dealt with people who weren't on programs.
The idea behind testing is that you send out matched pairs of applicants to find housing.
Testing is a tool used by fair housing organizations to investigate housing discrimination.
Generally, it'll be a black person matched with a white tester, or a Latino tester matched with a white tester, or a mom with kids matched with someone who says that they don't have kids.
It's impossible to determine whether discrimination has taken place unless you conduct enforcement testing. My job as a tester is to simply go to a particular housing site and to inquire about the availability of housing. They want to determine whether or not I'm going to be treated differently than a white tester or multiple white testers who are also going to be sent to that site with like characteristics.
We're able to compare and see how an African American potential renter is treated with being told, no, the apartment is not available. And then the white tester is told actually is available, and let me actually go out of my way to help you apply for this apartment because we want to get you there.
More widespread use of testing would make a difference, and there's some studies to even show that in areas in which there has been a lot of fair housing testing and complaints brought and even lawsuits brought, there's a diminishing of incidents of housing discrimination. Private fair housing groups have to be well funded so that you can bring more individual complaints, you can have more testing and bring more lawsuits. And finally, we need high damages, a set of remedies that actually make a difference and cause industry players to change their practices.
One of the things I find very satisfying in working with the clients I do is that they feel very uplifted and frankly made whole again by the fact that they're not just helping themselves, but they're helping others.
Mentally and emotionally, it has helped me because I feel that I have a home to come to, somewhere that's more than just housing. I know that I can take my key, open my door, and go in and cook my horrible meal because I don't know how to cook, fix my apartment the way I want it to look, and have a place to come home to. It's that I know what I'm worth, and I know what I'm not going to tolerate and what I'm not going to put up with.
When this happened to us, it was absolutely, well, no, we're not just going to sit for this. This is absolutely not going to stand.
We are humans and we have rights. We have a right to fight. And people like this shouldn't get away with it.
Okay. So, the packet or the handout that I had passed around, and I apologize, I used the blue highlighting and I shouldn't have because it's kind of hard to read, but it just compares what's been passed nationally by the Fair Housing Act and all the amendments that have kind of come after it, and then it highlights in yellow those things that are added in the City of Urbana's code. So we've added over the years creed, class, age, marital status, personal appearance, sexual preference, matriculation, which is basically, you know, are you a student or not, political affiliation, prior arrest or conviction record, and source of income. And so those are, I think, probably way ahead of the game than maybe a lot of cities. So I provided the definitions here. One thing that I found that was interesting about, so I was under the impression that familial status under the federal code would be, I mean, whether, you know, you have a married couple or single people or people who are dating or whatever. It has nothing to do with it. With that, familial status really just refers to families with kids. So landlords and people selling homes can't discriminate against people with kids. At least in terms of all the legislation that's gone on, that's the only thing that they've ever focused on. So I do appreciate that Urbana takes care to kind of separate that out. They throw marital status in there, and then they have this definition of family responsibilities, which also encompasses, I guess, people who are like fostering or looking to adopt, that kind of thing. And it was really interesting because I actually ran into this in Champaign a little bit because I have two roommates. We're all young working professionals in the area, and I had been walking through my old neighborhood, and this was in Champaign. And I saw a for rent sign, and the lady who I would assume she looked like the owner was standing out there, and I was like, oh, is this for rent? Like, how much is it going for? And she's like, oh, well, you know, who do you live with? And she wouldn't tell me how much it rented for. And I told her, oh, I live with my friends. You know, we all work in town or whatever. She's like, oh, well, it would probably be too expensive for you because I'm looking to rent this to a family. And I was like, I don't think she's allowed to do that. But at the time, I mean, it was kind of an interesting situation. But we were also trying to find a different neighborhood anyway. So anyways, after I looked into this, I realized that technically under the national classes that are protected, she probably was allowed to do that. There are certain exceptions. So if you're, say, if you own your own home, or let's say you own 2 homes, you live in one, you rent the other. If you do not manage more than 3 properties, you are allowed to discriminate, essentially. You're kind of considered as like mom and pop. So you can kind of select who you want to live in your houses. I know that's really interesting. So my guess is that she probably, this was a house maybe her family used to live in, but they still hold on to and they rent it out. However, I don't think that would be allowed in Urbana, and I should probably check with Todd Rent on that. But based on the added classes of marital status, family responsibilities, all these other things that they throw in there, source of income, matriculation, I don't think she would be allowed to do that in Urbana. But it was really interesting to me. The other exception, which I think more people know about, was if, so let's say the owner of a unit lives in the unit and is renting out either rooms in their house to people, or even if it's like it could be a 4-unit complex, and they happen to live in one. Let's say it's a bunch of townhouses, a row of 4 houses or whatever. They could live in one, and then they can pick whoever they want for the other 3 units that are connected or whatever. So those are the exceptions that were there. So that was kind of what I wanted to highlight that I found interesting in kind of studying this. And mostly I just kind of wanted to encourage everybody to like have discussions with friends and family about these things. If you hear something and it sounds like a red flag to you, like the conversation that I had with that woman, like it was kind of a red flag for me. I was like, I'm pretty sure you're not allowed to say that to me. But I didn't want to take it further because I wasn't all that interested in the house. So, but yeah, encouraging these sorts of conversations. And it is also really interesting that this field, they really go after, I guess, the landlords and the realtors side of things. So I feel like on some other issues, they kind of focus on educating victims or, protecting yourself and that kind of thing, which they do try to educate on that from that standpoint. But since the law is so heavily involved, I mean, this entire act is basically upheld by the legal system, that they kind of have to go top down. And so they're dealing with the realtors, that kind of thing. So I don't know if anybody had questions about this or if you've had your own sort of stories or people, who have had some interesting kind of situations that they've run into.
Didn't we at one point have some testers in the community?
We had tried to put that in our analysis of impediments, but it wasn't something that we could pursue. I think the commission at the time was not excited about it, or at least there were a few strong voices. Back in 2009, when we first brought it to the commission, they weren't interested. It sounded creepy to them. So I don't know. Maybe we've done it in the past, but not to my knowledge. If anybody would do it, it would be the tenant union.
Wasn't there cost involved, and we thought that the money was better spent on something that was more closely tied to improving physical infrastructure?
Yeah, that's definitely a historical perspective. I'd be curious to know. And even just doing for educational purpose. Not necessarily to like catch people in the act and wag your finger at them, but say like, maybe you didn't know, but this is actually not allowed in Urbana because maybe somebody owns properties in Champaign and Urbana and they don't know the differences. Although Todd Rent, who's our human relations officer, he said that the languages are actually pretty similar. So there isn't that much difference. I think the only difference is source of income. That's the one that I'm aware of. We protect source of income here. So if you have a Section 8 voucher, a landlord can't refuse to rent to somebody solely on the basis of them paying for their rent with a voucher from the housing authority. That's not the case in Champaign. Champaign still has that option. And Chris, if you ever want to jump in, if I say something wrong, I know you're probably more
I was going to, and pardon me, I missed the beginning of it because we were
okay.
actually doing about 4 hours of this today with Fred Underwood from the National Association.
I saw that.
of Realtors
How was that?
forth. Very good. He's here every year.
Awesome.
Could I ask where that particular film was from?
Yeah, HUD actually emailed it out to us at the beginning of the month. Okay. I would assume it's a new video. They certainly made it sound like it's a new video. But I could send out the link if anybody's interested.
It would appear so. I was simply curious about it, as many of those do, and as you were noting there. And one might be a little touchy about it in my profession. It's always talking about realtors, and that is rarely where the discrimination comes from, as you noted from your story. Mm-hmm. There are enforcers in every community on the state and federal level. They go through here all the time. And I think it's probably been about 15 years since there was a discrimination complaint against a realtor or property manager here. There's plenty of it, but it's generally the general public who's involved in it, and that rarely gets reported, unfortunately. It's restrictive to everybody when it really comes down to it. I mean, the law applies to everybody uniformly. The difference is that people who are licensed, like realtors, et cetera, have consequences if they're found in violation of it, which get very expensive and costly to their livelihood, whereas if it's not reported, or even if it is, there are very slim consequences to someone who's renting their own property, regardless of what they're doing, which is a little different. Now, as Fred will say, and Fred Underwood is a native Urbanite. His folks still live here in town. Actually, the state of Illinois is considerably more restrictive than the federal government. And within the state of Illinois, Urbana probably has the most restrictive law. As Fred will regularly say, there's state, federal, local, and then there's Urbana, which in actuality, the phrase in our code that says any other discrimination based upon categorizing or classifying a person rather than evaluating a person's unique qualifications means anything and everything can be discrimination in Urbana, technically. So it is about the broadest statute anywhere in the country when it comes down to that. So we should be, I guess, enforcing it. There should be either no possible violations or almost everything should be, one or the other, I guess. So it is a pretty broad and all-encompassing statute that we have.
Okay. Yeah, my question is, how much of a problem is it? How many complaints do you receive here at the city?
Yeah, I can pass that out. I had Todd Brent put together the complaints from the last year. Sorry I didn't pass them out earlier. I'll wait till everybody kind of has one. We don't actually get a ton of complaints. Just in speaking briefly with Todd, he was saying that a lot of these issues aren't necessarily being reported, or they're not as prevalent as they were back in the day, obviously. But there are still some that come up. So you can see there's various situations. A lot of these complaints, or I guess the ones on the bottom there, they were not within our jurisdiction. So this is people calling the city of Urbana with a complaint, and they'll speak directly with Todd. They can file an actual complaint, which it looks like there were some filings that happened in April where things are being put together. A lot of times Mr. Rent is able to kind of work that out with the landlord. Once he informs them of the law and the ramifications, they kind of realize this probably isn't the road I want to be going down, and they change their tune. That's kind of my understanding, is they prefer to have things, figured out just in conversation with the landlord, because it's honestly the cheapest way for everything to go down anyways. And then there's other times where someone doesn't necessarily want to follow through. Maybe they ended up finding a different apartment and they just want to drop the thing because it's stressful. So, but the protected classes that he has seen over the last, I guess, how far back did he go? Yeah, okay, I guess he went back through the last fiscal year, last year. We saw national origin, race, ethnicity. We've had a few people who were coming with Section 8 vouchers who are being denied. But it looks like, at least for one of the Section 8, there was no actual injury, so it's probably more of a miscommunication there. And then race, sexual orientation, and the retaliation one is interesting. Unfortunately, that wasn't in our jurisdiction, but that's something, if somebody knows that they're violating a class, protected class, they can sometimes make threats to somebody who is, saying, I'm going to complain about this, you're not allowed to do this. They can make threats against them, or that kind of thing. Kind of retaliation is what it goes under. I think sometimes that's more in the field of like persons with disabilities. If they're requesting modifications and the landlord's like, I am not going to do that, I'm going to evict you, that kind of thing. They're not allowed to do that either. So, Janice.
What about undocumented people? If you if you've rented a place and you discover
Oh, okay. I thought you meant undocumented cases. Okay. So undocumented is in like unregistered aliens?
Aliens.
Okay. That is a very good question. Based on what Chris said.
Depends on your... Excuse me, it depends on, again, it depends on the area and the jurisdiction. In Urbana, that would not be a reason to discriminate, obviously. But depending upon what sometimes what the restrictions are, for instance, renting a premise and not being able to provide adequate ID would be a possibility, where you may have somebody who's undocumented and complaining that the complaint would be that they were discriminated against because they were undocumented. But if they actually had no documents and could not verify who they were, that might be a legitimate restriction for whoever was managing the property.
Well, and I'd imagine they wouldn't be able to run a credit report. So.
Exactly, yeah. You couldn't really verify who they were or creditworthy or anything like that. So that would be kind of a shade of gray there that we would get into determining. I was kind of interested on these three on the bottom where it says no jurisdiction, meaning what?
That would mean it was probably somebody who was actually in Champaign that was calling us and didn't realize that they were working with the wrong city.
One would say, and maybe that doesn't apply as broadly, I know it does in real estate terms, there is no such thing as no jurisdiction. It's if you are observing something which is classified, and since it's in violation of a statute, it's classified as a crime, that's reportable anywhere you are.
Oh,
so I would...
Yeah, and I assume Todd doesn't drop these cases.
I would assume that we transferred that complaint over to the city of Champaign,
Exactly.
Which might be better than saying no jurisdiction or transferred jurisdiction.
I'll
Like
pass that along.
It appears that we just said, not my problem.
Not my problem, yeah.
Yeah,
no.
I don't think
No,
that's
actually,
what we did.
the city of Champaign does have a similar officer position over there.
Right.
So they do deal with this stuff. And then I know that they work with Champaign-Urbana Tenant Union, too,
Right.
For additional resources. So.
Interestingly enough, where you see in our business, the greatest level of discrimination is not amongst the sellers, it's amongst the buyers. So, for instance, should Fred approach me to buy a property and designate that he only wanted it to be in certain areas or certain neighborhoods or whatever, I'm compelled not to work with him, and actually I need to report that fact.
Really? I had no idea. I'd never heard that.
Discrimination by buyers is much more common than discrimination by sellers, because they're saying, I only want to live in this neighborhood, not that neighborhood, and so forth. And sometimes they are very clear about where they want to live or not live and why. And it's just not something that you can accommodate. So, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting.
Interesting. You got a couple here that say no basis, second and third from the top. Under protected class basis, what does that mean?
That would mean, well, kind of what I was saying before, like miscommunication. Somebody might have been interpreting something as discrimination, but they had bad credit. There's a legitimate reason that they were turned down. So it could be that they were, inferring that maybe it was discrimination because I got rejected, but if you look into it further, if the landlord says, well, they had terrible credit, I couldn't rent to them, the whole issue kind of is moot point at that point. So that would be my guess. At least in talking to Todd, he said that he comes across that sometimes too.
And who investigates these? Is that the Human Relations Commission that looks at this?
Yeah, I believe Todd is sort of the key person who communicates these things, and if they do file a complaint, I know that the commission oversees everything. But I'm not sure between taking things to court and filing the complaint. I don't know what the commission's role actually is in that. I know it is in the city code. I printed it out, but I didn't actually peruse it as detailed as I did.
I think those commissions normally make recommendations to city or state's attorneys for action as a result of whatever they come up with. I think
Okay.
that's what they're charged to do.
Yeah.
What would happen if any of these were in the township? I mean, could that would be a no jurisdiction, and where would that person get referred to?
Well, Cunningham Township does encompass part of Urbana. So I guess if it was somebody in the county, let's say, then I suppose they would be referred to Champaign County Regional Planning Commission over at the Brookings Administration Center. I'm assuming they would have some sort of spokesperson that people could talk to. Otherwise, I'm pretty sure Champaign-Urbana Tenant Union will take any complaints and work with anybody, because they work in both cities, particularly with the students, I think. So, yeah.
Again, I think that may be where some of the no jurisdiction comes in, is that it's an easier avenue in Champaign or Urbana to find where you can go to file a complaint. So sometimes they'll just gather the information and then forward it on to whatever body needs to deal with it from there.
Okay. You know, I was wondering, Jen, in your situation, what was that person objecting to? The
Oh
fact
yeah,
that you
I
were
was
single,
thinking about it.
or
I don't know
what?
if I actually detailed it. They were looking to rent to a family, so somebody who was actually going to stick around for a while. So she could have legitimately done this by, saying, "Well, I'm only signing 3-year leases." That would have been one way of achieving her outcome without actually discriminating. But instead, she was like, "Not telling me the rent, and you can't afford this." And I was like, "How do you know that?" So it was very interesting. Yeah, so I don't know, but I didn't pursue it any further since I wasn't that compelled. But yeah, my guess is, again, with like the mom and pop type situations, I mean, these are just people who probably, they moved out of their starter home, but they didn't want to let it go, or they couldn't sell it for what they wanted, so they're renting it out. And they're really, in Urbana, the law will protect folks like me, but nationally, that's not something that's not a protected class necessarily. They're exempt, rather, from upholding these protected classes, which is interesting. So I think there's less education on that, and especially if you're just, a person renting out a house and you've never done this before, you haven't been to the realtor classes and, kind of pursued education in this particular area. So I think it's probably totally common. Yeah.
I think if there's one thing I hear from, like people who rent, the apartment over their garage or kind of thing, is that they won't rent to students. And I don't think I ever fully realized that, at least in Urbana, even if it's a single property, they can't say that. But does that apply if they're living? I was trying to figure out the exceptions to the rule. So like if it was my house and I had an apartment over my garage and I said I wasn't going to rent to a student because I'm living there, that's technically allowed, or is that not allowed?
I think in Urbana it's not allowed, but I think that's where it gets fuzzy. Nationally, it's not. It's allowed.
Okay.
That person could choose to not rent to students, and it'd be perfectly within their rights. In Urbana, I think our law, it's really all-encompassing.
Okay,
so
so those
word got out.
exceptions about if you live there or if you only have a couple properties
Yeah,
aren't part of our.
It's allowed nationally and by the state of Illinois, but it does get gray in Urbana because of that one phrase that's in there, which does appear to encompass pretty much everything.
Yeah.
It's hard to get around that one phrase there, no matter what or where.
And that statement, he's referring to is that second paragraph on the handout I had sent out. It's the very last part. Or any other discrimination based upon categorizing or classifying a person rather than evaluating a person's unique qualifications relevant to an opportunity in housing, et cetera. But, I mean, right on there we have matriculation. That's status as a student.
Yeah, well, and I think it's that relevant to an opportunity is kind of any opportunity, so that there isn't anyone who doesn't have to comply with this rule. So
correct, in Urbana.
Yes, so that'll be the new thing I can say to people who tell me they won't rent to students. That's illegal.
Doing these laws, it's very difficult because what you're always trying to create with the law is a more equal basis, and there being no good intention that goes on unpunished. Usually every time you make one regulation, it creates a new way to get around it. So for instance, in a community like a college town like Urbana, if you maintain the idea that the single-family residents could discriminate against virtually anybody you wanted to, you would have two kinds of rental properties in Urbana. The multi-unit ones, which had no discrimination in them, and single-family homes, which could have any sort you wanted. So in a sense, you would create communities by having put in a law that tried to get away from that. So you got to keep adding another layer here and there to try and sort of fine-tune it to get away from that. Because where there's a lot of, any town in the Midwest that has a lot of single-family homes that may have a room or two rooms or whatever that could be rented to students, if you don't have regulations like that, you all of a sudden find two different communities.
And I still think, I'm trying to remember where I saw it. Urbana still does have that exception, I believe, of if you're renting out specific rooms in your house.
Rooms in your house is different than a
then
unit.
Yeah, you're still allowed to discriminate
Yeah.
there. Or discern. That sounds less offensive.
You're allowed to be selective. Yes.
Yeah, it would have to be a cause for eviction there, yeah. Well, and then you're looking for references in that instance. You know, if you're calling the previous places that they've listed and they said,
If you have somebody, and if rented to somebody and eventually they're not paying anymore, what do you do?
well, then you would evict them. But that would be a legal reason to do so. I mean, you're not discriminating against somebody if they're not paying the rent. That's part of the legal contract. Yeah.
So you wouldn't be just stuck with them.
Stuck with a freeloader? Yeah, no, I don't think that would fly.
That's why it's always recommended you have a lease with your kids. So
Well, that's kind of a fun note to end on. I think I've finished up, unless there's any other comments or questions.
Okay, I want to clarify for myself. I thought I heard you say something about 3 units or more. If you're renting out that, and you have 3 units or more, does that, did I hear correctly? Or?
So it's actually 3 or less. Nationally speaking, unless there are other local laws like we have in Urbana, you are exempt from the fair housing regulations. So you could discriminate all you want, essentially, and nobody could do anything about it. If you have 4 or more units, it's kind of seen, it's assumed that, okay, you're starting to run a business, this is probably a significant source of income for you. Then, yeah, you have to obey these laws. So, but at Urbana, we've kind of swept all of that, and nobody's exempt. So, all the mom and pops beware.
Okay, so as a commission here, do we have any input on anything?
Well, we will be actually drafting another, analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. So this will come up again on the agenda. And I'm trying to remember the process we went through. I know we did a few public hearings last time. I don't think we did focus groups. We might actually try to wrap it together with our consolidated planning process, because that's pretty intense. That's coming up this fall too. So we will be probably revamping our report, getting new data that's out there, speaking with Todd. I think I did an interview with the executive director of the Champaign-Urbana Tenant Union last time. So we'll definitely be having more conversations about this in the past. And I believe that'll be a report that you would be able to comment on. We could take it back, make adjustments, which is what we did last time, before we actually take it on to council. So, and I think that's a report that doesn't necessarily have quite the deadline as some of our other reports. So we wouldn't be under as much pressure to push it through. So if you guys have significant suggestions or, requests, that's something we'd be amenable to. I would be amenable to, because I'm probably the one writing it. So, so we'll keep you posted, because action will be required down the road.
Okay, questions from other commissioners? If not, is there more?
all I got.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It was very informative and interesting. Okay. So I assume that concludes our study session. Any other business or issues that commissioners wish to bring up at this time? If not, meeting is now adjourned. Thank you very much for your participation.